Welcome to Sheldon Genealogy, and this is part 2 of Sheldons in Gettysburg. And we're back going to be interviewing George again. And he's going to tell us a little bit more about Sheldons at Gettysburg, and particularly how he got to finding out the story of Lieutenant George Sheldon. So, George, with that, can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up here?
Well, this part of the story, it really goes into the basics of me searching for my own Sheldon family genealogy and my own tree. I'm George Sheldon, as everybody knows now. I'm a junior, so I'm named after my father, and my father was named after his great-grandfather, who is George W. Sheldon. He's the one that actually brought my line to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I still live today. And he came down here around 1915, brought his family, brought my grandfather down. My grandfather was actually born in New York.
1915 or 1815?
1915.
Oh, so you came in. I'm sorry. I thought it was. So your great grandfather came.
He was born in 1869.
Oh, okay.
That's when my great grandfather, the one that came down here, was born in 1869, George W. Sheldon.
Okay.
And then his son, Harold, my grandfather, he was born in Sparrowbush, New York, 1899. Harold, by the way, is the first Sheldon that I know of in my line that could read and write.
So, George, you were looking for your George Sheldon, your great-grandfather, and is that how you ended up finding Lieutenant George Sheldon?
Yes, I was just doing routine search on the computer, looking for George W. Sheldon. He's my great-grandfather. He came from the New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania border area, brought the family here to Lancaster County in 1915. And I'm just still looking for information about him. And what do you know? I found that there was a George W. Sheldon buried in Gettysburg. And this was probably a good 12, 13 years after I had wrote the book and had it published. I did not know at the time when I was writing the book that there was a George W. Sheldon buried in Gettysburg.
Wow. So that gave you a little bit more of a connection, even though that the Lieutenant George W. Sheldon that you found, was that your great-grandfather?
No, it wasn't at all. In fact, my great-grandfather, George W. Sheldon, he was actually born in 1869. And being born in 1869, that was 6 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. So certainly was not a connection. And at first I didn't pay much attention to it and just continued on, but it was always one of those things that was in the back of my mind. Who was this George W. Sheldon? I have to tell, as far as part of the story, the way that they handled soldiers that were killed in battle in Gettysburg, at the Battle of Gettysburg, was quite problematic. The Army did not carry basic things that they carry today, such as coffins. What they would do is, when they needed a coffin, and the only soldiers that really got coffins were officers. But when an officer was killed and they needed a coffin, they would go to a local cabinet maker and get the wood or have that cabinet maker build a coffin. So what would happen is, when a soldier was, especially because of the mass killings that occurred over there of the soldiers, they would pretty much just bury them where they fell, anywhere that it was close. And there was another major problem. There were several major problems, but soldiers in those days did not have what we know commonly as dog tags. But as long as their fellow soldiers, the ones from their company, were with them, everybody would know, well, this is that person or that's that. The problem is that when the company would move, in other words, they had orders, they were now on the march, they were going after the enemy, they were being positioned somewhere else. Any of their soldiers that had died, they're just left laying there, and somebody else would come along and then bury them. And they didn't have, like I said, they didn't even have coffins. They didn't have anything to mark the graves with. Sometimes they would use what we would call cartridge boxes, where some of them would write a name on if they happened to know who it was. Many times they had no idea who it was. So this was just the way that it was done. One of the things that we sort of shocked about in today's world, but that's really what happened. And as we started to look a little bit more about this Lieutenant George W. Sheldon, he was one that fell in battle, and he was buried where he fell.
And so he was a lieutenant, and he was a sharpshooter, I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, he was in the United States sharpshooters. And the best way to describe what their job was, they'd be snipers. They were used to target the enemy. They would go after officers. They would go after, for example, also artillery people, the ones that could really disrupt and make it problematic for the enemy.
And so I know that you did a little bit of research on Lieutenant George, and I think you have some letters, and you when you were in Gettysburg this past summer, we did some videotaping of you in that area. So let us cut to that. George, where are we now?
We are still in Gettysburg. I actually should say about 3 miles south of Gettysburg. I'm in a place called Pitzer's Woods, which has a distinct Sheldon connection. And that's the reason I'm standing here. And
the statue that is to your, I guess that's to your left there?
That would be a statue of Confederate General James Longstreet. He is the person that had the Confederates positioned here in Pitzer's Woods. And Pitzer's Woods was on the second day of the battle. His troops had arrived. And this area where I'm standing was totally controlled by the Confederate Army.
Okay, but you just mentioned that there was a very memorable Sheldon connection. So
there's a very distinct Sheldon connection to this particular part of the battlefield. There was a young lieutenant. In fact, he had just made lieutenant about a month and a half before the battle. Previous to that, he was a sergeant in the quartermaster corps. And previous to that, he was an enlisted man, a private, and he had joined the 1st U.S. Sharpshooter Division. He was he was joined in and mustered in Detroit, Michigan. His name was George W. Sheldon. So naturally, I have a connection to him with a name like that. My great-grandfather was also George W. Sheldon.
Fantastic. And so I have a feeling that and this George, when you wrote the book, you didn't know about specifically. Am I correct?
I did not know anything about his story. Of course, when I wrote the book was not about Sheldons. The only Sheldon that was connected to the book is me. I never thought anything about Sheldons being at the Gettysburg battle at the time when I was putting together the book. And of course, I really wasn't writing so much about the battle, although I had to go into that in some detail, because the book was really about the aftermath of the battle.
Right. So now are we going to find out a little bit more about what happens with our George W. Sheldon?
Well, I'm certainly going to tell you a little bit about him right now. The first thing to sort of understand is that when we're in a battlefield and there's 75,000 federal troops, I'm going to point that way. And in the area where I'm at, there's 75,000 Confederate troops. It's real important you know exactly where your enemy is. And on the second day, everybody was still positioning for location. And intelligence is one of the most important things you need to have as a commander. So the commander that was over on that part of the battlefield sent out the sharpshooters to begin to do some reconnaissance and to find out whether or not there actually were Confederate troops in this area where I'm standing. Somewhere in this area is where Lieutenant George W. Sheldon was shot and killed by Confederates. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the story, but I can't tell it to you near as well as the person that was later in charge of his burial party. He had written a letter to his father, Mr. Sheldon. We don't know his father's name precisely at the time of this recording, but I do want to read to you the words of Lieutenant E.A. Wilson. I don't know where Lieutenant Wilson's from, but I think his letter is certainly interesting and tells us an awful lot about what went on here in these woods where I'm standing. So as I move out of camera so you can see the monument a little bit, this letter was written from headquarters of the 1st USS, that's the sharpshooters, battlefield of Gettysburg on July 5th, 1863. That would have been 3 days after Lieutenant Sheldon was killed. The letter goes, Mr. Sheldon, sir, it becomes my painful duty to inform you of the loss of your son, Lieutenant George W. Sheldon. He was killed on Thursday, July 2nd, in the early part of the first day's battle. Words fail me to give consolation for the loss of such a noble son. He was a gallant and brave soldier, and he had died like a brave champion of the cause of liberty. You can have the satisfaction of knowing that you will never cause to blush for his name as a soldier. We all called upon to mourn the loss of near and dear friends in this our great struggle for human liberty. I had him buried decently as our circumstances would permit and placed a board at the head of his grave to mark the place where he now lies. Any information you may wish with regard to him, you can have by addressing me as many letters as you wish. I am, sir, very respectfully yours, most obedient servant, Lieutenant E.A. Wilson. And I have more to tell you about Lieutenant Wilson in just a little while.
Thank you, George. That was very poignant. What beautiful words.
I couldn't say it. What can I add to that?
Hey, George, can we just, yeah, we're still recording, so that's really great. Can you just describe this scene out to what we're looking at and that this is part of the battlefield?
All I can tell you is that it's just from Pitzer's Woods looking out across the battlefield. Let me move a little bit closer if you're interested in it. I'll get out here further. You said you like to see cannons, so there's a couple
There
cannons
we go, yeah.
sitting there. But there's one of the key points right there. I don't know how well you can see it.
Oh, we
in the
can.
distance. Do you see like the big, I'm going to call it the big mountain?
Is that Little Big Top?
No, that's actually Big Round Top.
A big round top. Okay.
Yeah, Little Round Top would be to the left of it. You see like when you're looking, like the left side, and then the right side's the Big Round Top. I'm sorry, the right side's the Big Round Top, the left side's the Little Round Top.
Very good. That's a beautiful shot. Beautiful shot. It really gives you the feel.
And the left side, or the one that's on the left side, that's where the monument is to the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters. But I can't get up there because, like I told you, that road's closed right now.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about Lieutenant George. We did get to see the approximate area in which he was slain Um, and can you tell me where he's resting today?
Lieutenant George W. Sheldon was reinterred. And this was one of the things that I did cover pretty extensively in the book. But there's now the Soldiers National Cemetery at Gettysburg. This is probably one of the more famous of all, where President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. And there's very few people that never heard of the Gettysburg Address. So certainly one of the more well-known things about Gettysburg. When, again, it was a huge problem, how many people had died in the battle. And the really temporary makeshift graves, they were not well-constructed graves. They were not well thought out. If you happened to die in the middle of a field, that's where they would bury you. If you happened to be buried along or died along a road, you'd be buried along the road. This was summertime, and they didn't bury the bodies very deeply. And we can just imagine what happened as bodies began to come up out of the ground. And it was just it was so bad in the town of Gettysburg that the citizenry walked around with little bottles of that they'd hold up to their nose to try to kill the actual smell of death. So we can just imagine what it was. And then as they finally got together and decided we're going to create this national cemetery, one of the jobs that they had to do was to reinter the fallen soldiers. And the men that they hired to go do that, it certainly was remarked how much brandy they would consume. You can just imagine what kind of job that was in the heat of summer. And summers in Pennsylvania can become quite humid, quite hot. And in November of that year of 1863, that's when they dedicated the cemetery, and that's when President Lincoln arrived and gave his short, brief, but certainly outstanding speech. And I'm pleased to say that during the visit, I was able to go over to the cemetery and actually locate Lieutenant George's grave. And here we go.
I'm now entering the cemetery. And where I have the camera pointing right now, that is the Lincoln, I don't want to call it memorial, but certainly a monument to his connection here. There's part of one of the signs. And where we're going is over into this area there. And you see I'm right here. Okay. So we're heading over into that area. A little bit of a hike, but worth it. Supposedly, I've been told, I don't know if this is true or not, but where that brick stand is right there, that is where Lincoln sat. He didn't sit on those bricks, obviously, but that's the position of where they were when they dedicated the cemetery. There's only one known picture of him being here at the cemetery, and it's sort of a blurred picture. His speech was so brief that the photographer didn't have time to take a picture. There's the official name of this memorial. And certainly one of the more photographed places in the park.
Very nice.
You'll also see, as I walk down this way, there's a black fence. And on the other side of that fence is what's known as Evergreen Cemetery. There became a bitter battle between two local attorneys over getting the cemetery established here. And I actually covered that pretty much detail within the book.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
But that cemetery is, for lack of a better way, we'll call it a private cemetery. Many of the townsfolk that are mentioned in the book are actually buried there within that cemetery. I'm standing at the grave of Lieutenant George W. Sheldon, United States sharpshooter. He's buried here at the Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lieutenant Sheldon, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice to our country. May God bless you. God bless our country. And on behalf of all your cousins, your extended family, Sheldon Genealogy salutes you.
Amen. That was wonderful being able to visit that area in Pitzer Woods at Gettysburg. And in part 4 of this video series on Sheldons at Gettysburg, we'll be delving in a little bit more about Lieutenant George W. Sheldon.